In 2006, Mexico declared war on its own cartels. Soldiers filled the streets, helicopters thundered over cities, and the government promised to reclaim control. But instead of peace, the crackdown shattered old cartels into ruthless factions, igniting a two-decade conflict that bled through borders, reshaped power, and changed Mexico forever. In December 2006, Mexico's newly elected president, Felipe Calderón, stood before the nation and declared a war that would define an era. Only days after taking office, he ordered thousands of soldiers into his home state of Michoacán to combat powerful drug cartels that had long controlled vast swaths of territory through terror and bribery. The plan was to confront organized crime with military strength, restore public security, and dismantle the vast narco-empires that had burrowed into every level of society. For many Mexicans, it seemed like a long, overdue act of defiance, but few realized that the decision would unleash one of the bloodiest conflicts in modern Latin American history. By the time Calderón took power, cartels were no longer mere traffickers of cocaine, marijuana, and heroin. They had evolved into sprawling criminal syndicates with military-grade weapons, armored convoys, and transnational networks reaching deep into the United States, Central America, and Europe. The Sinaloa cartel, led by Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, dominated the Pacific coast. The Gulf Cartel controlled the Northeast, while its brutal enforcement wing, Los Zetas, formed by former elite soldiers who defected, introduced a new era of violence defined by public executions, kidnappings, and intimidation. Ciudad Juárez, Tijuana, Reynosa, and Monterrey were already flashpoints, cities where the rule of law had eroded and police often worked for whichever cartel paid more. Calderón's deployment of the army was meant to fill the vacuum left by years of corruption and weak policing. Convoys of Humvees rolled through Michoacán's hills, soldiers raided drug labs hidden in avocado farms, and federal police were embedded alongside them. Within months, similar operations spread to Guerrero, Baja California, and Tamaulipas. At first, the government showcased large drug seizures and the arrests of mid-level traffickers as signs of progress. But the cartels retaliated with fury. Assassinations of police chiefs, grenade attacks in city centers, and mass killings became almost daily news. The more the state pressed, the more the cartels splintered, fighting both the military and each other for control of smuggling routes. The violence was not contained. It spread like wildfire. In 2008, Ciudad Juárez became the epicenter of the conflict as the Sinaloa cartel and the Juárez cartel waged an all-out war for one of the most lucrative corridors into the United States. Entire neighborhoods emptied as families fled north, while local morgues overflowed with bodies marked by torture. Between 2008 and 2010, more than 7,000 people were killed in Juárez alone. Soldiers patrolled the streets, curfews were imposed, and journalists faced death threats for reporting on the war. For many residents, life became a cycle of fear. Gunfire at night, mass graves by morning, and silence in between. Behind the chaos, a deeper transformation was taking place. The crackdown had disrupted old alliances, shattering cartels that once maintained hierarchies and territories through fragile truces. With each high-profile capture, new factions emerged. When leaders were killed or extradited, their lieutenants turned on one another. The Gulf Cartel split from Los Zetas in 2010 after years of uneasy cooperation, triggering a wave of massacres across northern Mexico. Towns like San Fernando became infamous when mass graves were discovered, evidence of the brutality used to control migration routes and drug corridors. The Mexican government continued to present the campaign as a fight between good and evil, law and lawlessness. But the lines blurred as reports surfaced of soldiers and police engaging in extrajudicial killings, forced disappearances, and torture. In regions like Tamaulipas and Guerrero, civilians found themselves trapped between cartel gunmen and federal forces. Kidnappings became rampant. not only for ransom, but as tools of intimidation. Narco banners, public messages hung on bridges or walls, became a new language of terror, with cartels issuing threats or mocking rivals and officials. As Calderon's term advanced, international involvement deepened. The United States, concerned about the flow of drugs and violence across the border, launched the MA-REDA initiative in 2008, providing billions in military aid, training, and surveillance technology to Mexican forces. Drones tracked smugglers from the skies, and intelligence sharing intensified between the DEA and Mexico's intelligence services. Yet despite this coordination, production and smuggling continued to rise. Cocaine shipments were replaced with methamphetamine and fentanyl, cheaper to produce and easier to conceal. The business adapted faster than the war could contain it. In 2012, when Enrique Peña Nieto succeeded Calderon, he inherited a country exhausted by conflict. More than 60,000 people had been killed and tens of thousands were missing. Peña Nieto promised to shift the focus from confrontation to prevention, emphasizing economic development and police reform. For a moment, the violence seemed to stabilize, but the underlying dynamics of power had not changed. The cartels had learned to decentralize. Smaller groups like the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, known as CJNG, rose to prominence with staggering speed, combining military discipline with ruthless efficiency. Led by Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, alias El Mencho, CJNG expanded across more than half of Mexico within a few years, challenging even the mighty Sinaloa cartel. The Sinaloa organization, meanwhile, continued to operate despite the capture of its elusive leader, El Chapo Guzman, in 2014. His arrest was hailed as a major victory for the government, but within months, he escaped through a mile-long tunnel dug beneath his prison cell, a feat that humiliated Mexican authorities worldwide. When he was recaptured in 2016 and extradited to the United States a year later, it marked the end of an era, but not of his cartel's power. His sons, known as Los Chapitos, took control of parts of the empire, while internal rivalries and external pressure gave rise to yet more bloodshed. Throughout this period, civilians bore the heaviest cost. Entire communities in states like Guerrero, Michoacán, and Sinaloa armed themselves in self-defense, forming vigilante groups known as autodefensas. In towns where police were either complicit or powerless, farmers and laborers took up rifles to protect their families. Some of these groups were later absorbed into official security forces, while others were infiltrated by cartels, blurring the distinction between protector and predator. The state's monopoly on violence was slipping away, replaced by a patchwork of local power structures that answered to whoever controlled the territory. The media landscape changed dramatically as well. Reporters who dared to cover organized crime were threatened, kidnapped, or killed. Entire regions became information black holes, where local newspapers self-censored to survive. Citizens turned to social media for updates, sharing videos and photos of gunfights, roadblocks, and disappearances. The digital age made the violence visible in real time, but it also spread fear faster than ever. Cartels began using these platforms themselves, broadcasting executions or posting propaganda to project dominance. Meanwhile, Mexico's institutions strained under the weight of the war. Corruption scandals reached high levels of government, exposing collusion between officials, police, and traffickers. In 2014, the disappearance of 43 students from Ayotzinapa in Guerrero became a national tragedy, symbolizing the deep rot within the system. The students were abducted by local police and handed over to a cartel, their bodies never found. The case shocked the world and ignited protests across the country, demanding justice and accountability. For many, it confirmed that the violence was no longer confined to cartels, but intertwined with the state itself. Despite these failures, the flow of drugs never stopped. Mexico remained the primary supplier of heroin and methamphetamine to the United States, while fentanyl, a synthetic opioid far more potent than heroin, began flooding the market, fueling a deadly epidemic north of the border. The cartels adapted their logistics, using tunnels, drones, and semi-submersibles to move product, while laundering billions through banks, shell companies, and real estate. The war on drugs had become a war of adaptation, where every government success was met with cartel innovation. By the late 2010s, violence surged again. The CJNG emerged as the most powerful and violent organization in the country, openly confronting the military and rival groups alike. Its fighters used military-grade weaponry, grenade launchers, armored trucks, and even drones armed with explosives. Videos of confrontations circulated online, showing convoys of men in tactical gear parading through rural highways, waving the group's insignia. The Mexican state, despite years of militarization, seemed unable to contain them. When Andrés Manuel López Obrador took office in 2018, he promised a new approach summarized by the phrase, abrazos, no balazos. Hugs, not bullets. His government sought to address the roots of violence through social programs and poverty reduction, arguing that force alone could not end the bloodshed. Yet the militarization continued under a new name, as the National Guard replaced federal police but remained under military command. High-profile incidents tested this new strategy. In 2019, an operation in Culiacan aimed to capture Ovidio Guzman, one of El Chapo's sons. The mission spiraled out of control when hundreds of Sinaloa gunmen flooded the city, taking hostages and overpowering security forces. The government was forced to release Ovidio to prevent a massacre, a decision that exposed the limits of state power and emboldened the cartels. In the years that followed, Mexico's landscape of organized crime continued to fragment. Dozens of smaller factions emerged, each controlling local rackets, extortion, fuel theft, and migrant smuggling. Towns once known for agriculture or tourism became centers of criminal control. The violence became less centralized but more unpredictable. Massacres in rural villages, ambushes on police convoys, and assassinations of mayors and journalists. For many Mexicans, the line between war and peace had disappeared altogether. By the time the conflict passed its second decade, more than 400,000 people had been killed and over 100,000 were missing. Families organized search brigades, combing deserts and forests with shovels and dogs, looking for traces of the disappeared. Their work filled the void left by the state, uncovering thousands of clandestine graves that told the story of a nation still bleeding from within. What had begun as a government campaign to restore order had become a sprawling, multi-layered war involving cartels, the military, civilians, and international forces. The Mexican drug war was no longer just about drugs. It was about power, survival, and the cost of a state at war with itself. Each administration claimed a new strategy, but the cycle of violence, corruption, and impunity endured. The cartels evolved faster than any government policy could keep up with, embedding themselves deeper into the economy and politics. As the conflict entered its third decade, the faces of the cartels changed, but their influence remained. In border towns, in mountain villages, and in Mexico's heartland, the echoes of the first military deployment in 2006 still resonated. The war had reshaped not only the map of organized crime, but the very identity of a nation caught between resilience and ruin. By the early 2020s, the landscape of Mexico's drug war had transformed into a maze of competing forces, where old names lingered and new ones rose with alarming speed. The cartels that once dominated the trade had fractured into hundreds of smaller cells, each controlling fragments of the territory once ruled by giants. The result was a country dotted with invisible borders drawn not by governments, but by crime. In the mountains of Guerrero, the valleys of Michoacán, the deserts of Chihuahua, and the bustling streets of Jalisco, different groups operated their own rules, collecting taxes from local businesses, running extortion networks, and deciding who lived or died within their reach. The Sinaloa cartel, though battered by arrests and internal rivalries, remained one of the most powerful syndicates in the world. It had learned to adapt, decentralizing leadership, forging new alliances, and shifting toward synthetic drugs. Under the fragmented leadership of El Chapo's sons and veteran traffickers like Ismael, El Mayo, Zambada, the cartel expanded its presence beyond the Americas, forming partnerships with European and Asian criminal organizations. It became a global enterprise, moving fentanyl, methamphetamine, and cocaine through international ports and airports, using legitimate businesses as cover. Despite decades of arrests, extraditions, and raids, its structure endured like a hydra, regenerating every time the state claimed victory. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, meanwhile, was becoming Mexico's most aggressive force. Led by El Mencho, a former police officer turned trafficker, CJNG built an empire rooted in speed and terror. Its rise was marked by high-profile confrontations and open defiance of the state. In 2015, CJNG gunmen shot down a military helicopter with a rocket-propelled grenade during an operation in Jalisco, killing several soldiers. The attack shocked the government and signaled that the cartels no longer operated in shadows. They were fighting on open ground. Over the next years, CJNG expanded into more than half of Mexico's states, battling rivals in Guanajuato, Veracruz, and Michoacán, while extending its reach into Central and South America. The violence in Guanajuato illustrated the new nature of Mexico's war. Once a hub of industry and tourism, the state became one of the most violent regions in the country as CJNG clashed with a local group called the Santa Rosa de Lima Cartel. Their struggle wasn't over cocaine or heroin, but over fuel theft. Known locally as huachical, criminals tapped pipelines, siphoned fuel, and sold it on the black market, earning millions each year. The government launched operations to secure the pipelines, but corruption within local police and the sheer profitability of the trade kept the conflict alive. Entire towns became battlegrounds, with residents caught between rival gunmen and military patrols. The violence was not limited to the cartels themselves. Political assassinations surged as criminal groups sought control over local governments. Mayors, police chiefs, and even candidates for office were targeted across Mexico, often during election seasons. Organized crime had realized that political power was just as valuable as territory. Controlling a city hall meant controlling contracts, budgets, and police forces. In some municipalities, the line between cartel and government blurred completely. Local elections were won not by popular vote, but by the approval of whichever cartel dominated the region. At the same time, Mexico's missing persons crisis deepened. Families continued to organize search brigades, digging through fields and riverbanks in search of their loved ones. The discovery of mass graves became a grim routine, revealing thousands of unidentified remains. Many were victims of disappearances committed not only by cartels, but by state forces accused of acting with impunity. Civil society groups documented these findings, demanding accountability, while forensic teams struggled to match DNA profiles in an overwhelmed system. The sheer scale of loss reshaped entire communities, where nearly every family had a story of someone who never came home. Despite the government's efforts to portray progress, cartel influence extended far beyond violence. They had penetrated industries from construction and mining to agriculture and entertainment. In some rural areas, cartels financed local festivals, built roads, and handed out food, acts of strategic charity that blurred their image between criminal and benefactor. These gestures bought loyalty, or at least silence, from local populations. In other regions, fear alone maintained control. Towns lived under curfew, with lookouts posted at every entrance, watching for outsiders or soldiers. The military, which had been deployed continuously since 2006, became a permanent presence in everyday life. Bases were built across the country, and convoys patrolled highways, once used freely by civilians. Soldiers guarded oil refineries, airports, and customs offices. The National Guard, introduced in 2019, absorbed tens of thousands of troops and police officers, merging them into a hybrid force meant to restore order. Yet, reports of abuse, corruption, and human rights violations persisted. The promise of a civilian-led security strategy gave way to an enduring militarization that reshaped the relationship between citizens and the state. In October 2019, the failed operation in Culiacan, where Ovidio Guzman was briefly captured and then released, exposed the government's vulnerability. For hours, the city became a war zone as hundreds of Sinaloa gunmen surrounded military positions, blocked roads, and attacked security forces. Families hid in their homes as machine gun fire echoed through the streets. When the government ordered Ovidio's release to prevent civilian casualties, it was a rare public acknowledgement that the state had been outgunned. The event became known as El Culiacanazo, a moment that crystallized the balance of power in Mexico's long war, a government that could capture cartel leaders but not hold them. 2 years later, in January 2023, Ovidio was captured again in a massive military operation involving helicopters, armored vehicles, and hundreds of troops. The mission was swift and deadly, leaving dozens dead, including soldiers and cartel gunmen. His extradition to the United States months later was presented as a victory, but the cycle repeated. New leaders filled the vacuum, violence surged, and the underlying system remained unchanged. Each capture seemed to fragment the cartels further, multiplying the conflict instead of ending it. While the war's original aim was to stop the flow of drugs into the United States, the trade only evolved. Synthetic opioids like fentanyl became the centerpiece of cartel operations. Small quantities could yield enormous profits, and production no longer depended on coca fields in South America. Hidden labs across Mexico churned out tons of the substance. Using precursor chemicals imported from Asia, U.S. authorities reported record overdose deaths, and pressure mounted on Mexico to act. Both governments blamed each other. Washington demanded more action against production and trafficking, while Mexico pointed to U.S. gun exports that armed the cartels. The two issues, drugs flowing north, weapons flowing south, became the cycle that neither side could fully break. Inside Mexico, everyday life adapted to the rhythm of the war. Checkpoints dotted the highways, armored trucks escorted business convoys, and journalists traveled under threat. In cities like Tijuana and Monterrey, daily shootouts became background noise. In rural areas, teachers abandoned schools, doctors fled clinics, and young people were recruited or disappeared. The cartel's power was not only in their firepower, but in their ability to replace the state where it had failed, offering protection, jobs, and income in places the government barely reached. By 2024, the total death toll of the drug war had surpassed 500,000. The number of missing exceeded 100,000. Generations had grown up knowing nothing but conflict. Children played beside soldiers, villages held funerals weekly. The war had outlived presidents, strategies, and slogans. It had become a part of Mexico's fabric, a constant presence shaping its politics, economy, and culture. Internationally, Mexico's cartels extended their operations across continents. They established footholds in Spain, Australia, and West Africa, partnering with local gangs and smugglers. Their shipments reached ports in Antwerp, Rotterdam, and Sydney. Fentanyl precursors moved through Chinese chemical companies and Vietnamese suppliers. Money flowed through cryptocurrency and shell corporations scattered from Panama to Dubai. The Mexican cartels had become multinational corporations of crime, evolving faster than the law could follow. Within Mexico, new groups continued to rise. In Michoacán, the United Cartels Coalition fought CJNG for control of avocado production, a lucrative global export. In Guerrero, smaller factions waged constant wars over poppy fields and extortion of miners. In Zacatecas, the fight between Sinaloa and CJNG turned highways into killing grounds, with ambushes and mutilated bodies displayed as messages. Each region developed its own war, each fueled by local economies and old rivalries. There was no single battlefield, no single enemy, only a vast network of conflicts that fed off one another. The economic toll was staggering. Billions were lost in investment and infrastructure, while tourism, one of Mexico's strongest industries, faced constant setbacks due to security concerns. Cities like Acapulco, once glamorous destinations, became symbols of decline. Despite this, the drug trade remained one of the most profitable sectors of the underground economy, generating tens of billions annually. It financed luxury estates, private jets, and entire fleets of armored vehicles. It also financed communities. Cartels distributed food during natural disasters, built churches, and paid for schools. To many, the war no longer seemed like a battle between criminals and the state, but between competing systems of power. The government's approach evolved again as new administrations came and went. Peace talks were proposed, social programs expanded, and intelligence units restructured. Yet, none of these efforts dismantled the core of the problem, a state weakened by corruption, poverty, and inequality. In areas where the law had no reach, the cartels became the law. Their codes, their punishments, and their currencies ruled everyday life. The cultural influence of the drug war spread beyond Mexico's borders. Narco corridos, ballads glorifying drug lords, filled radios, while streaming platforms produced series and films that dramatized their stories. These portrayals turned traffickers into folk figures, mythologizing their power. The violence that once horrified the public became entertainment, a reflection of how deeply the conflict had penetrated society's consciousness. Meanwhile, the families of victims continued to search, march, and demand justice. Mothers carried photographs of their missing children through the streets, chanting for answers from a system that rarely responded. Forensic teams worked tirelessly, exhuming graves, matching DNA, and cataloging evidence that stretched across decades. Universities and NGOs joined the effort, documenting the war's impact in statistics and testimonies. The memory of those lost became a quiet form of resistance, keeping the story alive even as governments shifted attention elsewhere. In the borderlands, U.S. agencies intensified cooperation with Mexican counterparts. Joint task forces targeted smuggling routes, seized tons of drugs, and arrested major traffickers. But the results often mirrored the same pattern: temporary disruption followed by rapid regeneration. Cartels diversified into cybercrime, counterfeit goods, and human trafficking, ensuring that the flow of money never stopped. The war had become not just unwinnable, but self-sustaining, feeding off the very systems meant to stop it. By the mid-2020s, entire generations of cartel leaders had risen and fallen. The original figures of the 1980s and 1990s, Carrillo Fuentes, Beltran Leyva, Aureliano Felix, were gone, replaced by younger, more ruthless successors. The violence they left behind was no longer centralized or ideological. It was systemic, woven into local economies and institutions. The cartels no longer needed to overthrow the government. They simply operated within it, influencing elections, appointing allies, and directing money where they pleased. In many parts of Mexico, life continued under a fragile equilibrium. People went to work, children attended school, and markets reopened each morning, even as gunfire echoed in the distance. Ordinary citizens learned to navigate invisible borders, avoiding certain roads, towns, or times of day. Survival became an art of awareness, knowing who controlled what, when to speak, and when to disappear. The war, for most, was no longer a headline, it was a condition of existence. As Mexico moved further into its third decade of conflict, the question was no longer when the war would end, but what it had turned into. What began as a government campaign against organized crime had evolved into a complex web of power that shaped the nation's identity. From Michoacan's first military deployments to the sprawling networks that now reached every continent, the story of the Mexican drug war became the story of modern Mexico itself, a nation trapped between resilience and ruin, where the line between state and cartel had long since blurred, and where peace was not yet a promise, but a distant memory waiting to be reclaimed.